"You think because this is a courthouse you're safe," Officer Danny Blackwood growled, his voice cutting through the morning silence as his boots slammed into the black man's side. The force sent the victim sprawling across the courtroom floor, his papers scattering like evidence of a crime that just became undeniable. Danny stood over him, chest puffed with the arrogance of a man who believed his badge made him untouchable. He had no idea he was staring down at Chief Cole Malone, the new head of his department, who would remember every detail of this assault for the rest of Danny's very short career. "What state do you live in? Have you ever witnessed authority become a weapon in the hands of someone who forgot they're supposed to serve and protect?" The Riverside County Courthouse had seen its share of drama over the decades, but nothing quite like what unfolded that Tuesday morning in Courtroom 3B. The marble floors, polished to a mirror shine, reflected the pale fluorescent lights that cast everything in the harsh, unforgiving glow of institutional justice. Wooden pews, stretched in neat rows, filled with the usual mix of defendants, witnesses, attorneys, and observers who made up the daily theater of American jurisprudence. At 9:47 a.m., the courtroom was settling into its routine rhythm. Judge Patricia Henley had just called a brief recess in a domestic violence case, and the low murmur of conversation filled the air like the buzzing of bees in a hive. Court clerks shuffled papers with practiced efficiency. Attorneys whispered urgent conferences with their clients, and bailiffs maintained their watchful presence with the bored alertness of people who had seen everything twice. Officer Danny Blackwood entered through the back doors with the swagger of a man who owned every room he walked into. His uniform was pressed to razor-sharp creases, his badge polished to a blinding shine, and his boots clicked against the marble with the measured cadence of someone who wanted everyone to know he had arrived. At 34, Danny had spent 8 years with the Riverside Police Department, building a reputation as a hard-nosed cop who didn't take any nonsense from anyone, especially from people who didn't know their place. He scanned the courtroom with predatory efficiency, his pale blue eyes cataloging faces and sorting them into categories: lawyers who thought they were better than real cops, defendants who belonged in cages, and citizens who needed constant reminding about who really ran things. His gaze lingered on a black man sitting quietly in the third row, dressed in a navy blue business suit that looked expensive enough to be out of place in this part of town. The man was reading through a stack of documents, occasionally making notes in the margins with a gold pen that caught the light. His posture was straight but relaxed, the bearing of someone comfortable with authority, but not flaunting it. His graying temples suggested he was in his early 50s, and there was something about the way he held himself that spoke of military training or law enforcement experience. But all Danny saw was another black man taking up space where he didn't belong. Cole Malone had arrived at the courthouse 20 minutes earlier, carrying a briefcase full of reports and observations from his first week as the newly appointed chief of police. His swearing-in ceremony had concluded just 3 hours ago, and he wanted to spend his first official day observing how local law enforcement interfaced with the judicial system. He believed in leading from the front, in understanding every aspect of the communities he was sworn to serve. He had chosen to attend court proceedings in civilian clothes, wanting to observe without the artificial deference that came with rank and uniform. The suit was one of his best, navy blue wool, that his wife had insisted he buy for the appointment ceremony. The documents in his lap were personnel files, case studies, and reform proposals that he planned to implement in his first 90 days. Among them was a thick folder marked Problem Officers, Priority Review, that contained several names flagged by Internal Affairs, Community Complaints, and Federal Oversight Recommendations. Danny Blackwood's name was on the third page. The file contained 7 formal complaints spanning 4 years, excessive force during a traffic stop, racial profiling allegations from 3 separate incidents, inappropriate language during an arrest, and 2 instances of insubordination with superior officers. Each complaint had been investigated and closed with minimal action, protected by a police union that treated every criticism as an attack on law enforcement itself, and supervisors who preferred to transfer problems rather than solve them. Cole knew Danny's type intimately. He had served 32 years in law enforcement himself, rising through the ranks of 3 different departments before accepting the chief position in Riverside. He had seen how systems could protect bad actors, how bureaucracy could shield corruption, and how good cops could be driven out by cultures that prioritized loyalty over accountability. He had been hired specifically to change that culture, and Danny Blackwood represented everything that needed to change. But Danny had no idea who Cole was, and Cole preferred it that way. Anonymous observation revealed more truth than any formal inspection ever could. Danny approached the row where Cole was sitting, his boots deliberately heavy against the marble floor. He stopped directly beside Cole's seat and cleared his throat with theatrical emphasis. When Cole looked up from his documents, Danny was staring down at him with the dead-eyed expression of a shark sensing blood in the water. "Excuse me," Danny said, his voice loud enough to carry across half the courtroom. "You're in the wrong section. Defendants and their families sit in the back rows." Cole set down his pen carefully and looked up at Danny with calm, measuring eyes. "I'm not a defendant. I'm here observing court proceedings." "Observing?" Danny's voice dripped with skepticism. "You got business here, or are you just looking for trouble?" The conversations around them began to fade as people turned to watch the interaction. Court bailiffs shifted their attention toward the developing confrontation, but none moved to intervene. Danny Blackwood was known for his aggressive approach to maintaining order, and most courthouse staff had learned it was easier to let him handle things his way than to create friction with the police department. "I have every right to observe public court proceedings," Cole replied evenly, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "I'm not causing any disturbance." Danny's face flushed red above his collar. In his experience, black men who talked back were black men who needed to be reminded of their place. The fact that this one was dressed like he had money and spoke like he had education just made it worse. Danny had spent 8 years dealing with uppity suspects who thought a suit or a college degree gave them the right to challenge his authority. "Don't get smart with me," Danny snarled, his hand unconsciously moving to rest on his service weapon. "I don't like your attitude, and I don't like people who don't know when to keep their mouths shut." Cole remained seated, but his posture shifted almost imperceptibly. Anyone with military or law enforcement training would have recognized the change: shoulders squaring, weight redistributing, hands moving to positions that suggested readiness rather than aggression. Cole had been in enough confrontations to know when words were about to become violence, and he could see the rage building behind Danny's eyes, like pressure in a boiler. "Officer," Cole said quietly, "I recommend you step back and reconsider your approach. This is neither the time nor the place for whatever you're thinking about doing." The warning was delivered in the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but Danny heard only defiance. In his worldview, black men who failed to show proper deference were criminals who simply hadn't been caught yet. The expensive suit, the educated speech, the calm confidence, it all added up to somebody who thought he was better than the people who really ran things. "Time and place." Danny's voice rose to a near shout. "The time is now, and the place is wherever I say it is. You think because this is a courthouse you're safe? You think these fancy clothes make you something special?" Judge Henley looked up from her bench, frowning at the disturbance. But before she could speak, Danny had already moved past the point of no return. His rage, fed by years of unchecked authority and protected misconduct, finally found its target in a black man who refused to show the fear and submission that Danny believed was his due. "Let me teach you some respect," Danny growled, drawing his leg back like a soccer player preparing for a penalty kick. The assault happened in slow motion for those who witnessed it. Danny's steel-toed boot, polished to a mirror shine, and weighted with the full force of his 190-pound frame, drove upward into Cole's ribs with devastating accuracy. The sound of impact echoed through the courtroom like a gunshot, a wet, hollow crack that made several witnesses gasp and one elderly woman cry out in horror. Cole's body jackknifed from the force, his breath exploding from his lungs as he was lifted partially from his seat before crashing sideways into the wooden pew. His carefully organized documents scattered across the marble floor like leaves in a windstorm, personnel files and reform proposals mixing with case law and constitutional amendments in a papery chaos that somehow seemed symbolic of justice under assault. Cole hit the floor hard, his shoulders striking marble with a sound that made the court reporter wince. But even as he gasped for breath, even as pain shot through his ribs like lightning, His eyes never left Danny's face. There was no fear there, no submission, no acknowledgement of defeat. Instead, there was something that Danny couldn't quite identify, a calm, calculating assessment that suggested this was far from over. Danny stood over Cole's prone form, adjusting his uniform with casual arrogance, smoothing his badge and straightening his collar as if he had just completed a routine traffic stop, rather than committed felony assault in front of dozens of witnesses. His breathing was elevated from adrenaline, but his expression showed only satisfaction and the grim pleasure of a predator who had successfully established dominance. "That's what happens when people forget their place," Danny announced to the courtroom, his voice carrying the self-righteous tone of someone who believed his actions were not only justified but necessary. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before running your mouth to a police officer." The courtroom had fallen into stunned silence. Attorneys sat frozen with their mouths open. Court clerks stared in disbelief, and even the bailiffs seemed uncertain about how to respond to what they had just witnessed. Judge Henley was on her feet, her gavel in her hand, but the words wouldn't come. In 30 years on the bench, she had never seen anything quite like this. Cole pushed himself up slowly, his movements careful and deliberate. His suit was rumpled, but not torn, his dignity intact despite the assault. As he rose to his feet, brushing dust from his jacket with methodical precision, something in his posture commanded attention. This was not a man who had been defeated or intimidated. This was a man who was taking careful note of everything that had just happened, filing away details for future reference. Danny watched Cole rise with growing irritation. He had expected submission, apology, maybe even tears. Instead, he was looking at a man who seemed to be studying him like a specimen under a microscope. The calm, measuring gaze made Danny uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite articulate. "You got something to say?" Danny demanded, his hand moving back toward his weapon. "Because I've got all day to teach you lessons about respect." Cole finished brushing off his jacket and looked directly into Danny's eyes. When he spoke, his voice was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent courtroom. "Officer Blackwood," he said, and Danny's blood turned to ice at the sound of his own name, spoken with such calm certainty. "I think there are a few things you should know." The sound of his own name, spoken with such quiet authority, hit Danny Blackwood like a physical blow. His confident smirk faltered for just a moment before reasserting itself. But something cold had settled in his stomach. How did this man know his name? Danny's nameplate was regulation issue, visible on his uniform, but there had been something in the way Cole had said it, not reading it, but knowing it. "Yeah, that's my name," Danny replied, forcing bravado into his voice. "What's it to you? You filing a complaint? Good luck with that. The department knows how to handle troublemakers who make false accusations against officers." Cole bent down slowly, gathering the scattered documents that had been knocked from his hands during the assault. As he collected each paper, his movements were deliberate and precise, like a man who had spent decades in situations where attention to detail could mean the difference between life and death. The papers were more than just documents. They were personnel files, complaint records, and reform proposals that painted a comprehensive picture of the Riverside Police Department's systemic problems. Among the scattered sheets was Danny's own personnel file, now bearing a dusty footprint from where it had been kicked across the marble floor. The irony wasn't lost on Cole. He was literally picking up the pieces of evidence that would end Danny's career, evidence that Danny himself had helped scatter with his violent outburst. As Cole straightened the papers, his mind drifted back to the events of that morning, just 3 hours earlier, when he had stood in the mayor's office with his right hand raised, taking the oath that made him the newest chief of police for the city of Riverside. "I, Cole Malone, do solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution of the State of California, to bear true faith and allegiance to the same, to serve the people of Riverside with integrity and honor, and to discharge the duties of Chief of Police to the best of my ability. So help me God." The ceremony had been small and private, attended only by the mayor, the city council, and Cole's wife Sarah. They had chosen a low-key approach deliberately, wanting Cole to have time to assess the department's problems before announcing his appointment publicly. The previous chief had resigned in disgrace 6 months earlier following a federal investigation into corruption and civil rights violations, and the department was under consent decree from the Justice Department. Mayor Patricia Chen had been explicit about what she expected from Cole. "We need someone who can clean house without burning it down, someone who understands both police culture and community needs, someone who can restore trust that's been broken for decades." Cole had accepted the position knowing it would be the most challenging of his career. His research into the department had revealed a culture of impunity, where problem officers were transferred rather than terminated, where complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, and where community trust had eroded to the point where many residents viewed the police as an occupying army rather than public servants. The file on Danny Blackwood had been particularly troubling. 7 formal complaints in 4 years, multiple allegations of excessive force and racial bias, and a pattern of behavior that suggested someone who viewed his badge as a license for abuse rather than a symbol of service. What made it worse was that Danny had been repeatedly protected by supervisors who seemed more concerned with avoiding controversy than addressing misconduct. Cole had planned to make Danny's case a priority, to dig deeper into the complaints and determine whether termination proceedings were warranted. He had never imagined that his first encounter with Danny would be as the victim of an unprovoked assault in a public courtroom. "Officer Blackwood," Cole said again, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "Before you say anything else, I want you to understand exactly what just happened here. You assaulted a citizen in a public courtroom, in front of dozens of witnesses, while wearing the uniform and badge of the Riverside Police Department. You did this without provocation, without legal justification, and without any consideration for the consequences." Danny's face was flushing red again, but there was something different in his expression now. The absolute confidence was beginning to crack, replaced by a nagging uncertainty that he couldn't quite shake. Something about this man's bearing, his way of speaking, his complete lack of intimidation in the face of Danny's threats, was setting off alarm bells in the part of Danny's brain that had kept him alive through 8 years of street patrol. "Look, pal," Danny said, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "I don't know who you think you are, but you're nobody special. You're just another—" "Just another what, Officer Blackwood?" Cole interrupted, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. "Just another black man who deserves to be assaulted for sitting quietly in a public building? Just another citizen whose constitutional rights don't matter when they inconvenience your sense of authority?" The questions hung in the air like accusations, and Danny found himself struggling for a response. The rational part of his mind was beginning to recognize that he had made a serious mistake, but his pride and 8 years of unchecked authority wouldn't let him back down. He had built his entire identity around being the kind of cop who didn't take any crap from anyone, especially from people who didn't show proper respect. Cole finished gathering his papers and stood to his full height, which put him eye to eye with Danny despite the officer's tactical boots. Up close, Danny could see details that he had missed during his initial assessment: the slight bulge under Cole's left armpit that suggested a concealed weapon, the way he carried himself with the unconscious confidence of someone who had faced down armed suspects and hostile crowds, the calm alertness that spoke of decades of training and experience. "You're asking yourself questions right now," Cole observed, his voice conversational, but with an undertone of steel. "Questions about who I am, how I know your name, why I'm not afraid of you. You're wondering if maybe you made a mistake, if maybe you picked the wrong target today." Danny's hand moved unconsciously toward his service weapon, a reflexive gesture that Cole noted but didn't react to. In Cole's experience, officers who drew weapons in courtrooms usually ended up in federal prison, and he suspected that Danny was already in enough trouble without adding threatening a federal facility to his list of charges. "The truth is, Officer Blackwood, you didn't pick the wrong target. You picked exactly the right target, from my perspective. You see, I've been looking for officers like you ever since I accepted this position. Officers who think their badge gives them the right to abuse citizens. Officers who use their authority to settle personal scores or indulge their prejudices. Officers who have forgotten that they work for the people, not the other way around." Judge Henley had been watching the exchange with growing concern and fascination. As a veteran of the criminal justice system, she had learned to read people and situations with considerable accuracy, and what she was seeing didn't fit any normal pattern. The black man who had been assaulted was speaking with the authority of someone in law enforcement, but he wasn't wearing a uniform or displaying any obvious credentials. His bearing and manner of speaking suggested high rank, possibly federal level, which would explain his lack of intimidation in the face of local police aggression. More troubling was Officer Blackwood's reaction. The cocky arrogance that had preceded the assault was giving way to something that looked suspiciously like fear. Judge Henley had seen enough cops in her courtroom to recognize the signs of an officer who was beginning to realize he had made a career-ending mistake. "Officer Blackwood," she called out, her voice carrying the full authority of the bench. "I need you to step back from the victim and explain to this court why you felt it was appropriate to commit assault and battery in my courtroom." Danny turned toward the judge, grateful for any interruption that might break the growing tension of his confrontation with Cole. "Your Honor, this individual was being disruptive and challenging my authority. I was attempting to maintain order in accordance with my duties as a peace officer." By kicking an unarmed man in the ribs, Judge Henley's voice was sharp with disbelief. "Officer, I've been on this bench for 30 years, and I have never seen anything that could justify what you just did. You assaulted a citizen who was sitting quietly, reading documents, and causing no disturbance whatsoever." Cole stepped forward slightly, drawing attention back to himself. "Your Honor, if I may address the court?" Judge Henley nodded, her curiosity outweighing her concern for proper procedure. "Please, sir, I think we all need to understand exactly what happened here." "My name is Cole Malone," Cole said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. "As of 3 hours ago, I am the newly appointed Chief of Police for the city of Riverside." The words fell into the courtroom like stones into still water, creating ripples of shock that spread through the assembled crowd. Danny's face went white, then red, then white again as the implications crashed over him like a tsunami. Court clerks looked at each other with wide eyes. Attorneys stopped their whispered conversations, and even the bailiffs straightened to attention. "I was here this morning conducting an unannounced observation of how local law enforcement interfaces with the judicial system," Cole continued, his voice calm and professional. "I wanted to see how officers conduct themselves when they believe they're not being watched by supervisors. Officer Blackwood has provided me with exactly the kind of demonstration I was hoping to avoid." Danny felt the world tilting beneath his feet. Everything he thought he knew about the situation had just been turned upside down. The man he had assaulted wasn't just another black citizen who needed to be put in his place. He was Danny's new boss, the person who would decide Danny's future with the department, the man who now had first-hand experience of Danny's approach to police work. "That's impossible," Danny stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "The new chief isn't supposed to start until next month? Nobody told us." "Nobody told you because it wasn't your business to know," Cole replied evenly. "The mayor and I decided that an unannounced observation period would provide valuable insights into departmental culture and practices. Officer Blackwood, you have just provided me with more insight than I could have gained from months of formal inspections." The scattered documents that Cole held in his hands suddenly took on new significance. Danny could see now that they weren't random papers, but official-looking files and reports. His own personnel file was among them. He realized with growing horror, which meant that his new chief had been reviewing his record of complaints and misconduct when Danny had decided to provide a live demonstration of exactly the kind of behavior that had generated those complaints. "You're lying," Danny said desperately, his voice cracking with strain. "You're just some troublemaker trying to get cops in trouble. Show me some ID. Show me a badge." Cole reached into his jacket pocket with slow, deliberate movements, withdrawing a leather credential case that he opened to reveal the gold badge and official identification of the Riverside police chief. The badge caught the courtroom lights and seemed to glow with an authority that made Danny's own shield look like a toy by comparison. "Officer Daniel Blackwood, badge number 12047, Cole said, reading from the personnel file in his other hand. 8 years of service, 7 formal complaints, multiple allegations of excessive force and racial bias, currently under review for potential disciplinary action. As of right now, you are suspended from duty pending a full investigation into this incident and your entire service record. The words hit Danny like physical blows, each one stripping away another piece of the identity he had built around his badge and authority. Suspended, investigation, his entire service record under review. Everything he had worked for, everything he thought he was, crumbling in the space of a few sentences spoken by the man he had just assaulted. "You can't do this," Danny protested, his voice rising toward panic. "I was just doing my job. I was maintaining order. You were acting suspicious, sitting there in your suit, reading papers. I had reason to believe." "You had reason to believe what, officer?" Cole's voice was sharp as a blade. That a black man in a business suit reading documents in a public courthouse was somehow a threat that justified physical assault? That your badge gave you the right to kick a citizen for the crime of existing while black? The question stripped away every excuse, every justification, every rationalization that Danny might have used to defend his actions. In the harsh light of Cole's analysis, what had happened was revealed for exactly what it was: an unprovoked assault, motivated by racial bias and enabled by years of unchecked authority. Around the courtroom, witnesses were beginning to understand the full magnitude of what they had witnessed. This wasn't just police brutality. It was a police officer assaulting his own chief, demonstrating exactly the kind of misconduct that had brought federal oversight to the department. Phones were appearing in hands, cameras were being activated, and the story was already beginning to spread beyond the courthouse walls. Judge Henley brought her gavel down with a sharp crack that echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. "Officer Blackwood, you are in contempt of this court. Bailiffs, please place Officer Blackwood under arrest for assault and battery and any other charges that may be appropriate." As the bailiffs moved toward him, Danny looked around the courtroom with the desperate eyes of a man watching his world collapse. Just 20 minutes ago, he had been a police officer with authority and immunity. Now he was about to be arrested in the same courtroom where he had committed his crime by officers who had watched him assault their new chief. Cole watched the arrest proceedings with professional detachment, but inside, he felt a deep sadness for what this moment represented. Danny Blackwood wasn't just a bad cop. He was the product of a system that had failed to hold him accountable, that had enabled his worst instincts, and that had taught him to see his badge as a license for abuse rather than a commitment to service. But sometimes, Cole reflected as the handcuffs clicked around Danny's wrists, justice had a way of correcting itself. Sometimes the system found a way to hold people accountable, even when it had failed to do so for years. And sometimes, the very arrogance that made someone dangerous also made them careless enough to destroy themselves. As Danny was led away in handcuffs, Cole turned his attention back to the scattered papers on the floor. There was work to be done, a department to reform, and a community's trust to rebuild. The assault had been a traumatic beginning to his tenure as chief, but it had also provided him with a perfect example of exactly what needed to change. The real work was just beginning. The moment the bailiffs clicked handcuffs around Danny Blackwood's wrists, the courtroom erupted into barely contained chaos. What had been stunned silence transformed into urgent whispers, frantic phone calls, and the distinctive electronic chimes of social media notifications as word began to spread beyond the courthouse walls. The assault of a police chief by one of his own officers wasn't just local news. It was the kind of story that would dominate headlines from coast to coast. Margaret Chen, the court reporter who had been transcribing proceedings for 23 years, sat frozen at her stenograph machine, her fingers hovering over keys as she tried to process what she had just witnessed. In more than 2 decades of recording testimony, depositions, and legal proceedings, she had never seen anything that compared to the raw brutality and instant karma that had just unfolded before her eyes. "Sweet Jesus," she whispered to herself, her voice barely audible above the growing din of conversation. "I can't believe I just recorded a cop assaulting his own chief." Margaret's fingers began moving across her keyboard with renewed urgency as she realized the historical significance of what she was documenting. This transcript would be evidence in criminal proceedings, departmental hearings, federal investigations, and civil rights lawsuits. Every word, every pause, every inflection would be scrutinized by attorneys, investigators, and journalists seeking to understand how such a catastrophic failure of judgment could occur in full view of dozens of witnesses. In the gallery, Reverend Thomas Washington had been waiting for his turn to testify in a community impact hearing when the violence erupted. At 68, the Reverend had spent 5 decades fighting for civil rights and police accountability in Riverside's black community. He had seen every form of police misconduct imaginable, from subtle intimidation to outright brutality, but watching an officer assault what turned out to be his own chief left him momentarily speechless. "Lord have mercy," Reverend Washington murmured, reaching for his phone to call his congregation's attorney. "This is bigger than anything we've ever documented. This isn't just brutality. This is a police officer destroying himself and exposing the whole rotten system in one moment of uncontrolled rage." The Reverend's hands trembled slightly as he began typing a text message to send to community leaders across the city. For years, they had been calling for police reform, filing complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, and demanding accountability that never seemed to come. Now they had something unprecedented. A police officer committing assault against his own chief, captured on courthouse security cameras, witnessed by dozens of people, and documented in official court transcripts. 3 rows behind the Reverend, Maria Santos clutched her purse with white knuckles as she watched the bailiffs escort Danny away in handcuffs. Maria worked as a paralegal for the public defender's office, and she had seen Danny Blackwood in court before. He had a reputation among defense attorneys as an officer who took liberties with his testimony, who showed obvious bias against minority defendants, and who treated the courtroom as his personal domain rather than a temple of justice. "I knew this day would come," Maria whispered to her colleague, Janet Miller, who sat beside her taking rapid notes. "I've seen him threaten defendants, intimidate witnesses, and treat people like garbage, but I never imagined he'd be stupid enough to assault his own boss in front of half the courthouse." Janet nodded grimly as she continued writing. As a senior paralegal with 15 years of experience, she had developed an eye for officers who played fast and loose with the truth and the law. Danny Blackwood had been on her informal watch list for years, and she had advised multiple attorneys to be extra careful when he was testifying in their cases. "The thing is," Janet replied quietly, "this isn't really surprising when you think about it. Officers like Blackwood get so used to immunity, so accustomed to facing no consequences for their actions, that they start to believe they're untouchable. Today he learned that there are still some lines you can't cross." Near the front of the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Rachel Torres was frantically taking notes while simultaneously texting her supervisor about the unprecedented situation unfolding before her eyes. As the prosecutor assigned to several cases involving Danny Blackwood's testimony, Rachel realized that everything was about to become infinitely more complicated. "My God," she muttered to herself as she scrolled through her case files on her phone. "Blackwood is scheduled to testify in 6 different trials over the next 3 months. His credibility was already questionable. But now, defense attorneys are going to have a field day with this." Rachel's mind was racing through the legal implications. Every case that relied on Danny's testimony would now be compromised. Defense attorneys would argue that an officer capable of unprovoked assault in a public courtroom couldn't be trusted to tell the truth under oath. The DA's office would have to review hundreds of cases, potentially offer plea deals in situations where they previously had strong evidence, and face the possibility that convictions based on Danny's testimony might be overturned on appeal. Behind her, criminal defense attorney David Park was having similar thoughts, but from the opposite perspective. David had been representing defendants in cases involving Danny Blackwood for 3 years, and he had always suspected that the officer was willing to bend the truth to secure convictions. Now he had proof of Danny's character that would make it nearly impossible for prosecutors to use him as a credible witness. "This changes everything," David said quietly into his phone as he called his office. "I need you to pull every case file where Blackwood was a key witness. We're going to file motions to dismiss based on newly discovered evidence of the officer's unfitness for duty. This is the break we've been waiting for." Court clerk Jennifer Walsh had been working at the Riverside Courthouse for 12 years, and she prided herself on maintaining professional composure regardless of what happened in her courtroom. But watching a police officer assault someone who turned out to be the new police chief had shattered her usual calm. Her hands shook as she reached for the phone to call courthouse security and notify them that they had a situation that would likely attract media attention within the hour. Security desk. "This is Jennifer in courtroom 3B, she said in a voice that was steadier than she felt. "We just had a police officer arrested for assaulting the new police chief. You need to prepare for media response and possibly federal investigators. This is going to be huge." Jennifer had recognized Cole Malone the moment he identified himself, even though his appointment hadn't been widely publicized yet. She had processed the paperwork for his background check and credential verification just 2 weeks earlier, and she remembered being impressed by his extensive law enforcement background and reform-oriented philosophy. Watching him handle the assault with such professional dignity while clearly being in significant pain had only reinforced her positive impression. The security guard she was speaking to initially thought she was joking. "Jennifer, can you repeat that? Did you say a cop assaulted the police chief?" Officer Danny Blackwood kicked Chief Cole Malone in the ribs hard enough to knock him to the floor and scatter his papers, Jennifer replied, her voice gaining strength as she realized the historical significance of what she was reporting. "It happened right here in open court, in front of Judge Henley and about 40 witnesses. The bailiffs just arrested Blackwood, and Chief Malone is still here gathering evidence." In the jury box, which had been empty during the morning's proceedings, courthouse custodian Robert Hayes was setting up chairs for an afternoon trial when the violence erupted. Robert, who was 71 and had worked at the courthouse for 26 years, had seen every kind of drama imaginable, but nothing had prepared him for watching a uniformed police officer commit felony assault in broad daylight. "In all my years," Robert said to himself as he watched Cole methodically collecting his scattered documents, "I never seen anything like that. That officer just threw his whole career away in 10 seconds of stupid rage." Robert had served 2 tours in Vietnam and understood something about authority, discipline, and the chain of command. What he had witnessed wasn't just criminal assault, it was a complete breakdown of everything that law enforcement was supposed to represent. The fact that the victim had turned out to be the assailant's own commanding officer added a layer of military-style insubordination that Robert found particularly disturbing. Near the back of the courtroom, freelance journalist Lisa Park had been covering a routine hearing when she found herself witnessing what would likely become the biggest story of her career. Lisa had been investigating police misconduct in Riverside for 18 months, writing articles for local papers and national websites about the department's problems with accountability and community relations. "This is exactly what I've been writing about," Lisa said into her phone as she called her editor. "The culture of impunity, the racial bias, the complete lack of consequences for misconduct. Danny Blackwood just provided a perfect example of everything that's wrong with the system, and he did it by assaulting his own chief." Lisa's fingers flew across her phone's keyboard as she began drafting the opening paragraphs of what she knew would be a career-defining article. She had been in the courtroom gathering background information for a broader piece about judicial system reform, but now she had stumbled into breaking news that would dominate headlines for weeks. Judge Patricia Henley, meanwhile, was dealing with the immediate legal implications of what had occurred in her courtroom. In 30 years on the bench, she had developed protocols for handling everything from courtroom disruptions to medical emergencies, but she had no precedent for a police officer assaulting his own chief during court proceedings. "Bailiff Martinez," she called to the senior court officer, "I need you to secure the courtroom and ensure that all witnesses remain available for statements. This courtroom is now a crime scene, and we need to preserve evidence accordingly." Bailiff Carlos Martinez nodded grimly as he began implementing courthouse emergency protocols. Carlos had been working court security for 15 years, and he had always maintained a professional relationship with the police officers who testified in his courtroom. But Danny Blackwood's behavior had crossed every line of professional conduct and basic human decency. "Your Honor," Carlos replied, "I've already contacted the district attorney's office and the county sheriff's department. They're sending investigators to take statements from all witnesses. Should I also notify internal affairs?" "Chief Malone can handle departmental notifications," Judge Henley replied, glancing toward Cole, who was still methodically organizing his scattered papers. "Right now, my concern is ensuring that we have a complete record of what happened here, and that all witnesses are properly interviewed." The judge's mind was already working through the legal complexity of the situation. The assault had occurred in her courtroom, which meant she had direct jurisdiction over contempt charges. But the criminal assault charges would be handled by the district attorney's office, and the departmental consequences would be handled through police internal affairs processes. Coordinating between these different jurisdictions while ensuring that Cole's rights as a victim were protected would require careful navigation of competing interests and procedures. Throughout the courtroom, witnesses were beginning to process the full implications of what they had seen. Social media posts were already going viral, local news stations were being alerted, and federal investigators who had been monitoring the Riverside Police Department under the consent decree were receiving urgent notifications about a major incident involving police misconduct. Cole himself remained focused on collecting evidence and ensuring that proper procedures were followed. But he was acutely aware that the ripple effects of Danny's assault would extend far beyond a single criminal case. This incident would become a symbol of everything that was wrong with police culture, a teaching moment for departments across the country, and a test case for whether real accountability was possible within law enforcement systems that had historically protected their own. As Cole straightened the last of his scattered documents, he looked around the courtroom at the faces of the witnesses who had seen justice under assault and accountability finally enforced. These people would tell this story for years to come, and their testimony would ensure that Danny Blackwood's moment of rage would become a turning point in the fight for police reform. The truth, once witnessed by so many people, was impossible to deny or cover up. And sometimes, Cole reflected, that was exactly what justice looked like. The handcuffs around Danny Blackwood's wrists felt like shackles connecting him to a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. As Bailiff Martinez read him his rights in the same courtroom where he had committed his career-ending assault, Danny's mind reeled through a series of desperate denials and rationalizations that collapsed one after another under the weight of reality. "You have the right to remain silent," Martinez intoned with professional detachment, his voice carrying clearly through the courtroom that had fallen into an eerie quiet. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Danny barely heard the words. His eyes were fixed on Cole Malone, who stood 30 feet away organizing his scattered documents with the methodical precision of someone accustomed to preserving evidence. The gold badge in Cole's credential case caught the fluorescent lights and seemed to mock Danny with its undeniable authority. This wasn't some elaborate hoax or mistaken identity. The man Danny had assaulted was exactly who he claimed to be, the new chief of police for the city of Riverside. "This can't be happening," Danny muttered, his voice cracking with strain. "Nobody told us about a new chief. Nobody said anything about him starting early." Officer Janet Rivera, Danny's partner, who had been waiting outside the courtroom, pushed through the doors just as Martinez was completing the arrest procedure. Janet had worked with Danny for 18 months, and while she had always been uncomfortable with his aggressive approach to policing, she had never imagined it would lead to something like this. "Danny?" Janet's voice was barely above a whisper as she took in the scene, her partner in handcuffs, a black man in an expensive suit watching the proceedings with professional detachment, and a courtroom full of witnesses who looked like they had just seen history being made. What the hell happened here? Martinez turned toward Janet with a grim expression. "Officer Rivera, your partner just assaulted the new police chief in open court." Chief Malone was conducting an unannounced observation when Officer Blackwood decided to kick him in the ribs for the crime of sitting while black. The words hit Janet like physical blows. She had known Danny was a problem, had seen him use excessive force during traffic stops, had watched him treat minority suspects with obvious contempt. But she had never thought he would be stupid enough to assault his own commanding officer in front of dozens of witnesses. "Chief Malone?" Janet's eyes moved to Cole, and recognition dawned as she remembered the briefing materials they had received about the incoming leadership change. "Oh my God, Danny. Oh my God, what did you do?" Danny's face cycled through expressions of rage, denial, and desperation as the full implications of his situation began to sink in. 8 years of police work, a pension he was counting on for retirement, the respect and authority that came with wearing the badge, All of it was disappearing because he couldn't control his temper for 10 seconds. He was acting suspicious, Danny said desperately, his voice rising toward panic. He was sitting there reading papers, taking notes. How was I supposed to know who he was? He looked like trouble. Cole looked up from his documents, fixing Danny with a steady gaze that cut through every excuse and rationalization. Officer Blackwood, I was reading personnel files and reform proposals. I was taking notes about departmental policies that need to be changed. The only thing suspicious about my behavior was that it apparently threatened your sense of authority over citizens who don't show you the deference you think you deserve. The quiet authority in Cole's voice seemed to strip away Danny's last shreds of bravado. Here was a man who had just been violently assaulted, who was clearly in pain from the kick to his ribs, but who maintained complete professional composure while describing exactly what had happened and why. I didn't know, Danny pleaded, looking around the courtroom for any sign of sympathy or support. Nobody told me the new chief was starting early. If I had known who you were, if you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect, Cole interrupted, his voice sharp as a blade. But Officer Blackwood, the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that you thought my identity mattered. You thought it was acceptable to assault a citizen as long as that citizen didn't have enough authority to hold you accountable. Judge Henley leaned forward on her bench, her expression grave as she addressed the fundamental issue that Cole had identified. Officer Blackwood, are you telling this court that you would not have committed assault if you had known the victim's identity? Are you admitting that you believe some citizens deserve to be kicked while others deserve protection? The question hung in the air like an indictment, and Danny found himself trapped between admitting to bias and acknowledging that he had assaulted someone he thought was powerless to fight back. Either answer would destroy him, but his silence was equally damaging. Janet Rivera watched her partner's internal collapse with a mixture of sympathy and disgust. She had known this day would come eventually. Danny's racism and brutality had been escalating for months, protected by a police culture that valued loyalty over accountability and a union that treated every complaint as an attack on law enforcement itself. Danny, Janet said quietly, you need to stop talking. You need a lawyer, and you need to start thinking about damage control. But Danny was beyond rational thought. 8 years of unchecked authority, of facing no consequences for his actions, of being protected by supervisors who preferred to transfer problems rather than solve them, had created a mindset where accountability seemed impossible. The idea that he could face real consequences for his behavior was so foreign to his worldview that he couldn't process it. This is bullshit, Danny snarled, his voice echoing through the courtroom. I'm a police officer. I was maintaining order. I don't care who you are. Nobody gets to disrespect the badge. Cole stood slowly, his movements careful, due to the pain in his ribs, but his posture commanding attention from everyone in the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had spent 3 decades in law enforcement and understood exactly what the badge was supposed to represent. Officer Blackwood, the badge doesn't command respect. The badge represents a commitment to serve and protect, to uphold the Constitution, to treat every citizen with dignity regardless of their race, class, or status. You have dishonored that badge today, and you have demonstrated exactly why this department needs fundamental reform. District Attorney Rachel Torres, who had been frantically coordinating with her office throughout the crisis, stepped forward to address the court. Your Honor, the DA's office will be filing charges of assault and battery, deprivation of rights under color of law, and any other charges that may be appropriate. We will also be reviewing every case in which Officer Blackwood has been involved to determine if his conduct has compromised the integrity of ongoing prosecutions. The announcement sent another wave of shock through Danny's system. Federal civil rights charges carried serious prison time, and the review of his cases meant that dozens of convictions he had helped secure might be overturned. Defense attorneys would argue that a cop who assaulted his own chief couldn't be trusted to tell the truth under oath, and juries would have a hard time disagreeing. You're destroying my life over nothing, Danny said, his voice breaking with desperation. I made a mistake. I didn't know who he was. Cops make mistakes all the time. Cole's expression hardened as he addressed the fundamental flaw in Danny's reasoning. Officer Blackwood, this wasn't a mistake, this was a choice. You chose to assault someone you believed was powerless to fight back. You chose to use your authority to inflict violence rather than maintain peace. You chose to see a black man in a business suit as a threat that justified physical force. Cole paused, letting the words sink in before continuing. The tragedy isn't that you made this choice. The tragedy is that you've been making similar choices for years, and the system has protected you from consequences. Today that protection ends. Reverend Washington, who had been watching the exchange from the gallery, stood slowly and addressed the court. Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to say something about what we've all witnessed here today. Judge Henley nodded, recognizing the Reverend as a respected community leader whose perspective would be valuable. Please proceed, Reverend Washington. For 50 years, I've been fighting for police accountability in this community, the Reverend said, his voice carrying the weight of decades of struggle. I've documented brutality, filed complaints that disappeared into bureaucratic black holes, and demanded justice that never seemed to come. Today we saw something unprecedented, instant accountability for police misconduct. The Reverend's gaze moved to Danny, who was staring at the floor in defeat. Officer Blackwood, you didn't just assault Chief Malone today. You assaulted every citizen who has ever been victimized by police brutality. But you also did something you never intended to do. You demonstrated that accountability is possible, even in a system that has historically protected bad actors. Cole listened to the Reverend's words with deep appreciation for their wisdom and perspective. The assault had been traumatic and painful, but it had also provided an opportunity to demonstrate that reform was possible, that accountability could be enforced, and that the badge could be restored to its proper meaning. As Martinez prepared to escort Danny from the courtroom, Cole approached with slow, deliberate steps. He stopped just outside of arm's reach, maintaining a professional distance while delivering what amounted to Danny's epitaph as a police officer. Officer Blackwood, Cole said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. 8 years ago, you took an oath to serve and protect. Today you broke that oath in the most public and undeniable way possible. Your career in law enforcement is over. Not because of who I am, but because of who you chose to be. Cole paused, studying Danny's face for any sign of understanding or remorse. What he saw was primarily self-pity and anger, which confirmed his assessment that Danny was beyond redemption through training or counseling. I want you to remember this moment, Cole continued. I want you to remember that your career ended, not because you were unlucky or because you were set up, but because you chose to use your authority as a weapon against someone you thought was powerless. That choice defines you, and it will follow you for the rest of your life. Danny looked up at Cole with eyes that mixed hatred and desperation in equal measure. You think you've won something here? You think this changes anything? There are 100 cops just like me in this department, and they're not going to forget what you did here today. Cole's expression didn't change, but his voice carried a note of steel that made everyone in the courtroom understand that he was not a man to be threatened. Officer Blackwood, if there are 100 cops like you in this department, then I have 100 more problems to solve. Thank you for helping me identify the scope of the work that needs to be done. As Martinez finally led Danny toward the courtroom doors, the fallen officer looked back one last time at the scene of his destruction. Cole was returning to his documents. Judge Henley was preparing to resume normal court business, and the witnesses were beginning to disperse. Life was moving on without him, and his moment of rage had become nothing more than a cautionary tale about the consequences of unchecked authority. The handcuffs clicked against Danny's belt as he walked, a metallic rhythm that sounded like a countdown to the end of everything he had thought he was. Behind him, the courtroom gradually returned to its normal rhythm, but the echoes of accountability would reverberate through the Riverside Police Department for years to come. Sometimes justice was swift and undeniable. Sometimes the system worked exactly as it was supposed to. And sometimes the very arrogance that made someone dangerous also made them careless enough to destroy themselves in front of the people who needed to see that destruction most. The heavy courthouse doors slammed shut behind Danny Blackwood with a finality that echoed through the marble corridors like a death knell. As Bailiff Martinez escorted him toward the holding cells in the basement of the courthouse, Danny's mind struggled to process the complete destruction of his life that had occurred in less than 30 minutes. The handcuffs around his wrists felt like they weighed 1,000 pounds, and every step toward the cells was a step away from the authority and respect he had spent 8 years building. In the courthouse's central booking area, Sergeant Lisa Rodriguez looked up from her paperwork as Martinez approached with his prisoner. Rodriguez had been processing arrests for 12 years, but she had never seen a police officer brought in as a defendant, especially not for assaulting his own chief. The booking procedures would be the same as for any other suspect, but the implications were staggering. "What are the charges, Martinez?" Rodriguez asked, her fingers poised over the computer keyboard that would create Danny's arrest record. "Assault and battery, deprivation of rights under color of law, contempt of court, and conduct unbecoming an officer," Martinez replied, his voice professional but tinged with the gravity of the situation. Suspect assaulted Chief Cole Malone in open court in front of approximately 40 witnesses. Rodriguez's fingers froze over the keyboard. She had heard rumors about a new police chief starting soon, but she hadn't expected his first day to begin with being assaulted by one of his own officers. The charges Martinez was listing would end Danny's career and likely send him to federal prison. "Jesus, Blackwood," Rodriguez said, as she began entering the information into the system. "What were you thinking?" Danny remained silent as the booking process began, but his mind was racing through the implications of what was happening. Every step of the procedure was another nail in the coffin of his law enforcement career. Fingerprints that would be run through federal databases, mugshots that would appear in news articles, and an arrest record that would follow him for the rest of his life. Meanwhile, back in Courtroom 3B, Cole Malone was coordinating with courthouse security and law enforcement officials to ensure that proper protocols were followed in the aftermath of the assault. Despite the pain in his ribs and the shocking nature of what had occurred, Cole maintained his professional composure as he worked to turn a traumatic incident into a teaching moment about accountability. "Chief Malone," said Captain Frank Morrison, who had arrived within minutes of being notified about the incident. Morrison was a 20-year veteran of the Riverside Police Department and had been serving as interim chief before Cole's appointment. His face was pale with shock and embarrassment as he approached Cole with obvious trepidation. "Captain Morrison," Cole replied evenly, extending his hand in a professional greeting, despite everything that had happened. "I appreciate your quick response to this situation." Morrison shook Cole's hand with visible relief that the new chief was maintaining professional courtesy despite being assaulted by one of Morrison's officers. "Chief, I can't begin to express how sorry I am about what happened here today. Blackwood's behavior is completely unacceptable and does not represent the values of this department." Cole studied Morrison's face, reading the mixture of genuine remorse and political calculation that was typical of middle management in troubled organizations. Morrison was probably a decent officer who had been trying to manage an impossible situation with insufficient support and conflicting pressures from the police union, city hall, and community activists. "Captain, I appreciate your apology, but I'm more interested in your assessment of how something like this could happen," Cole said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to getting honest answers to difficult questions. Officer Blackwood didn't develop his attitudes and behaviors overnight. What systemic failures allowed him to reach the point where he felt comfortable assaulting a citizen in a public courtroom? Morrison's shoulders sagged as he considered the question. He had known Danny was a problem officer, had received multiple complaints about his conduct, but had been hamstrung by union protections and a culture that prioritized loyalty over accountability. "Chief, Blackwood has been a disciplinary problem for years," Morrison admitted. "Multiple complaints, several internal affairs investigations, but every time we tried to take serious action, the union intervened with grievances and appeals. The previous administration preferred to transfer problem officers rather than fight the political battles necessary to terminate them." Cole nodded grimly, recognizing a pattern that was all too common in police departments across the country. Problem officers were shuffled around like toxic assets, moved from unit to unit and shift to shift, but never actually removed from positions where they could harm citizens and undermine public trust. "Captain, As of right now, Officer Blackwood is suspended without pay pending the outcome of criminal proceedings and departmental hearings, Cole said. I also want a complete review of every complaint filed against him, every investigation that was closed without action, and every supervisor who signed off on keeping him on the street despite his documented problems. While Cole was establishing his authority and beginning the process of accountability, news of the assault was spreading through the law enforcement community like wildfire. At the Riverside Police Station, officers gathered around televisions and computer screens as early news reports began to appear, showing footage of Danny being led away in handcuffs and identifying Cole as the victim of an unprovoked assault. Officer Kevin Walsh, who had been Danny's partner for 2 years before requesting a transfer, watched the news coverage with a mixture of satisfaction and dread. Walsh had filed multiple complaints about Danny's behavior, reports that had been buried by supervisors who preferred to avoid controversy rather than address misconduct. I tried to warn them, Walsh said to his current partner, Officer Maria Santos. I documented everything, the excessive force, the racial slurs, the way he treated citizens like they were enemy combatants. But nobody wanted to hear it because it was easier to transfer me than to deal with Danny. Santos nodded sympathetically, remembering the whispered conversations among officers who were uncomfortable with Danny's behavior but felt powerless to challenge it within a department culture that discouraged ratting out fellow officers. Maybe this will finally change things, Santos said hopefully. If the new chief is willing to hold officers accountable for assaulting him, maybe he'll be willing to listen to complaints about other problems too. At City Hall, Mayor Patricia Chen was conducting an emergency meeting with the city attorney and the public information officer as they tried to manage the political fallout from having a police officer assault the newly appointed chief. The mayor had specifically hired Cole to reform the department and restore community trust, but she hadn't expected the reform process to begin with such a dramatic demonstration of the problems they were trying to solve. How bad is this going to be? Mayor Chen asked City Attorney Robert Park, who was frantically reviewing the legal implications of the situation. Politically or legally, Park replied grimly. Politically, this is actually good for us in the long term. It demonstrates that we hired the right person for the job and that real accountability is finally possible. Legally, it's more complicated. We're going to face federal scrutiny, civil rights lawsuits, and pressure to review every case that involved Officer Blackwood. Public Information Officer Janet Miller was monitoring social media and news coverage as the story began to go viral. The combination of police brutality, instant accountability, and dramatic irony was proving irresistible to news outlets and social media users across the country. This is trending nationally, Miller reported. The hashtag Chief Malone is getting thousands of posts per hour, most of them supportive of the chief and critical of police culture. This could actually help us with community relations if we handle it right. While city officials were managing the political response, Cole was working with federal investigators who had arrived to assess whether the assault violated Danny's civil rights or constituted a federal crime. Special Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI's Civil Rights Division had been monitoring the Riverside Police Department under the federal consent decree, and Danny's assault on his own chief represented exactly the kind of misconduct the federal oversight was designed to address. Chief Malone, I need to document your injuries and get your statement about what occurred, Agent Kim said as she set up a recording device in the courthouse conference room. This incident falls under our ongoing investigation into patterns of misconduct within your department. Cole winced slightly as he adjusted his position in the chair, the pain in his ribs serving as a constant reminder of Danny's assault. Agent Kim, I want to be clear that while I was the victim today, this incident represents a much larger problem with police culture and accountability. Officer Blackwood's behavior toward me was the same behavior he's been displaying toward citizens for years. Agent Kim nodded as she began recording Cole's formal statement. Chief, based on our preliminary review of Officer Blackwood's record, this appears to be part of a pattern of civil rights violations that were systematically ignored by department leadership. Today's assault may have been directed at you, but it represents the same mindset that has been victimizing the community for years. As the federal investigation began in earnest, Danny sat in his holding cell, staring at the concrete walls that represented his future. The booking process had been completed, his personal effects had been confiscated, and he had been issued the orange jumpsuit that marked him as a defendant rather than an officer of the law. For the first time since the assault, Danny was alone with his thoughts, and the full magnitude of his situation was beginning to sink in. 8 years of police work had ended in handcuffs. A pension he had been counting on for retirement was gone. The respect and authority that came with wearing a badge had been stripped away by his own actions in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Danny's cellmate was a career criminal named Tony Vasquez, who had been arrested on drug charges and was awaiting transfer to county jail. Tony recognized Danny from previous arrests and couldn't resist commenting on the irony of the situation. Well, Tony said with obvious amusement. If it isn't Officer Danny Blackwood, the pride of Riverside PD. I heard through the grapevine that you kicked your own chief in the courthouse. That true? Danny remained silent, staring at the wall, but Tony continued his commentary with the satisfaction of someone who had finally seen karma catch up to a corrupt cop. You know what the beautiful thing is, Danny? All those times you planted evidence, lied on reports, and beat up suspects who couldn't fight back. All that came back to bite you when you picked on somebody who could fight back. Poetic justice, man. The words hit Danny like physical blows because they contained enough truth to be undeniable. He had spent years abusing his authority, confident that his badge would protect him from consequences. Today he had learned that there were still some lines that couldn't be crossed, some people who couldn't be victimized without facing accountability. Back at the courthouse, Cole was preparing to leave after giving his statement to federal investigators and coordinating with local law enforcement officials. The assault had been traumatic and painful, but it had also provided him with valuable insights into the scope of the problems he would need to address as chief. Judge Henley approached Cole as he gathered his documents, her expression reflecting both concern for his welfare and admiration for his professional handling of an impossible situation. Chief Malone, I want you to know that in 30 years on this bench, I have never seen anyone handle a situation like this with such grace and professionalism, she said. What Officer Blackwood did to you was reprehensible, but your response has been exemplary. Cole smiled grimly as he secured his files in his briefcase. Your Honor, sometimes the worst moments in our careers also become the most important. Today's assault was traumatic, but it also provided me with a perfect example of what needs to change in this department. Officer Blackwood's downfall will become the foundation for everyone else's accountability. As Cole walked toward the courthouse exit, his ribs aching with every step, he reflected on the strange turns that life could take. He had come to court that morning, planning to observe routine proceedings and assess departmental culture. Instead, he was leaving as the victim of an assault that would dominate headlines for weeks and serve as a catalyst for fundamental police reform. The assault had been personal, but the consequences would be institutional. Danny Blackwood's moment of rage had just become the spark that would light a fire under decades of accumulated corruption and complacency. Sometimes justice worked in mysterious ways, and sometimes the very act of attacking it made it stronger. Within 6 hours of Danny Blackwood's arrest, the Riverside Police Department had transformed from a quiet municipal agency into the epicenter of a national conversation about police accountability and reform. News vans lined the street outside headquarters, reporters thrust microphones at anyone in uniform, and social media exploded with commentary about an officer who had literally assaulted his way out of a career by attacking his own chief. Internal Affairs Captain Diana Foster had been preparing for a routine day of reviewing minor misconduct complaints when her phone exploded with calls about the courthouse incident. As a 22-year veteran of the department and one of the few senior officers with a reputation for thorough investigations, Foster found herself at the center of what would become the most significant case of her career. This changes everything, Foster said to her assistant, Detective Michael Chen, as they reviewed the preliminary reports flooding in from the courthouse. We're not just investigating one officer's misconduct anymore. We're investigating how the entire system failed to prevent something like this from happening. Foster had been reviewing Danny Blackwood's personnel file for months, trying to build a case for termination based on his pattern of complaints and misconduct. The police union had blocked her efforts at every turn, filing grievances and appeals that turned disciplinary action into years-long bureaucratic battles. Today's assault had cut through all of that legal maneuvering like a knife through paper. "Captain, we've got reporters calling for comment, federal investigators requesting files, and the police union demanding access to Blackwood," Detective Chen reported, his voice strained with the pressure of managing multiple crises simultaneously. "How do you want to handle the media response?" Foster looked out her office window at the growing crowd of journalists and camera crews gathered outside the building. "We handle it with complete transparency," she said firmly. "For too long, this department has tried to manage its image instead of addressing its problems. That ends today." 3 floors below Foster's office, Police Union President Jack O'Brien was conducting his own emergency meeting with union lawyers and representatives. O'Brien had spent 15 years defending officers against complaints and disciplinary action, but he had never faced a situation where an officer had committed felony assault against his own chief in front of dozens of witnesses. "This is a public relations nightmare," O'Brien said, loosening his tie as he paced around the conference room. "Blackwood just handed every police critic in the country the perfect example of everything they say is wrong with law enforcement." Union attorney Rebecca Martinez reviewed the preliminary reports with growing concern. "Jack, I don't think we can defend this one. Assault on a superior officer, federal civil rights violations, assault in a public courthouse. There's no legal theory that justifies what Blackwood did." O'Brien slammed his hand on the conference table, his frustration boiling over. 20 years I've been protecting officers from Monday morning quarterbacking and political persecution. Now Blackwood throws it all away by kicking his own chief in front of half the courthouse. The union's dilemma was unprecedented. Their mission was to defend officers against disciplinary action. But Danny's assault was so egregious and so public that any attempt to defend him would undermine their credibility in defending other officers facing legitimate complaints. Sometimes even the police union had to draw lines that couldn't be crossed. At the FBI field office downtown, Special Agent Sarah Kim was coordinating with a team of federal investigators who had been monitoring the Riverside Police Department under the consent decree. Danny's assault on Chief Malone represented exactly the kind of civil rights violation that federal oversight was designed to prevent and prosecute. "This isn't just about one officer," Agent Kim explained to her team during an emergency briefing. "This is about a culture that enabled and protected someone like Blackwood for years. Our investigation needs to identify everyone who knew about his problems and failed to take action." Agent Kim pulled up Danny's personnel file on the conference room screen, showing a pattern of complaints that stretched back to his first year on the force. 7 formal complaints, multiple allegations of excessive force and racial bias, and a clear pattern of escalating misconduct. Yet he was never disciplined beyond brief suspensions and mandatory retraining. FBI analyst David Park highlighted the broader implications as he reviewed the department's complaint handling procedures. "Agent Kim, based on our analysis of internal affairs records, Blackwood's case appears to be typical rather than exceptional. We're seeing systematic patterns of complaints being dismissed, investigations being closed without action, and problem officers being transferred rather than terminated." The federal investigation was expanding beyond Danny's individual case to examine the institutional failures that had enabled his misconduct. This wasn't just about prosecuting one bad cop. It was about reforming an entire system that had prioritized protecting officers over protecting citizens. Meanwhile, at Riverside Community College, Professor Angela Washington was conducting an emergency session of her criminal justice reform class to discuss the real-time example of police accountability unfolding in their own community. Professor Washington, who also served as a community activist and police oversight advocate, saw the incident as a teaching moment about systemic reform. "Students, what we're witnessing today is unprecedented," Professor Washington explained to her packed classroom. "For the first time in recent memory, we're seeing immediate, undeniable accountability for police misconduct. But the question we need to ask is what systemic changes are necessary to prevent future incidents?" Student Maria Rodriguez raised her hand with a question that cut to the heart of the issue. "Professor, Why did it take an officer assaulting his own chief to get accountability? Why weren't the 7 previous complaints enough to remove him from the street? Professor Washington nodded approvingly at the question. That's exactly the right question, Maria. The answer reveals everything wrong with police accountability systems. Complaints from citizens are treated as attacks on law enforcement, but assault on a superior officer is treated as an attack on the hierarchy itself. The class discussion that followed would be recorded and uploaded to social media, where it would be viewed hundreds of thousands of times as part of the broader national conversation about police reform that Danny's assault had triggered. Back at police headquarters, Cole Malone was settling into his new office while nursing his injured ribs and fielding calls from mayors, police chiefs, and federal officials across the country who wanted to understand how he planned to handle the fallout from the assault. Cole's response to being victimized by one of his own officers was being studied as a model for leadership under crisis. "Chief Malone, this is Chief Robert Davis from Portland," came the voice through the speakerphone during one of dozens of similar calls. "I wanted to express my support for how you've handled this situation and ask if you'd be willing to share your approach to police accountability with other departments facing similar challenges." Cole leaned back in his chair, wincing slightly from the pain in his ribs. "Chief Davis, I appreciate the call. What happened today wasn't pleasant, but it's provided us with an opportunity to demonstrate that accountability is possible, even in departments with serious cultural problems. The key is treating every citizen with the same respect you'd want for yourself or your family." The conversation continued for 20 minutes, with Cole explaining his philosophy of leadership through example and accountability through transparency. By the end of the day, he would conduct similar conversations with police executives from 12 different cities, all seeking guidance on how to address misconduct without destroying department morale. At the Riverside City Jail, Danny Blackwood was discovering what life looked like from the other side of the bars he had spent 8 years putting people behind. The orange jumpsuit that marked him as a defendant rather than an officer felt like a costume in a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. "Blackwood, you've got a visitor," announced Corrections Officer Lisa Park, who had worked at the jail for 8 years and remembered Danny from his frequent trips to book suspects. The irony of processing his arrest paperwork earlier that day hadn't been lost on her. Danny's visitor was defense attorney Jennifer Walsh, a public defender who had been assigned to his case. Walsh had faced Danny in court dozens of times over the years, watching him testify against her clients with an arrogance that suggested he believed his badge made him untouchable. "Officer Blackwood," Walsh said, as she sat across from Danny in the jail's attorney conference room, "we need to discuss your legal options, which are unfortunately quite limited, given the circumstances of your case." Danny looked up at Walsh with desperate eyes, clinging to the hope that legal expertise might somehow salvage his situation. "Can you get me out of here? I've got 8 years of good service, no criminal record. This was just a misunderstanding." Walsh reviewed the charges listed in Danny's file, her expression growing more grave with each page. "Mr. Blackwood, you're facing federal civil rights charges, felony assault, contempt of court, and departmental charges that will end your career regardless of the criminal outcome. The prosecution has dozens of witnesses, courthouse security footage, and a victim who happens to be your own police chief." The reality of his situation hit Danny like a physical blow. There would be no plea bargain that saved his career, no technicality that dismissed the charges, no union protection that could overcome the video evidence of his assault on Chief Malone. "What are you telling me?" Danny asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm telling you that your law enforcement career is over," Walsh replied with professional detachment. "Our only option is to negotiate a plea agreement that minimizes your prison time and financial liability. The best case scenario is probably 2 to 3 years in federal prison and lifetime disqualification from law enforcement." While Danny was confronting the end of his career, community leaders across Riverside were organizing emergency meetings to discuss how to ensure that the momentum from his arrest would lead to lasting police reform. Reverend Thomas Washington convened a gathering of civil rights activists, community organizers, and concerned citizens at his church to plan their response. "Brothers and sisters," Reverend Washington addressed the packed sanctuary, "today we witness something unprecedented: immediate accountability for police misconduct. But we cannot let this moment pass without demanding systemic changes that will prevent future abuses. The meeting would result in a comprehensive reform agenda that included civilian oversight of police discipline, mandatory body cameras for all officers, community input on police hiring and training, and regular public reporting on complaint resolution. The reform proposals would be presented to the City Council within a week, backed by community organizations that had never before had such clear evidence of the need for change. As the sun set on Danny Blackwood's first day as a defendant rather than a police officer, news coverage of his assault on Chief Malone was dominating national headlines. Cable news networks ran continuous coverage of the story, with legal experts and police reform advocates analyzing the implications for law enforcement accountability across the country. The assault had lasted 10 seconds, but its consequences would reshape policing in Riverside and serve as a catalyst for reform efforts nationwide. Sometimes justice worked through tragedy, and sometimes the very act of attacking accountability made it stronger than it had ever been before. Cole Malone drove home that evening with aching ribs, but a clear sense of purpose. His first day as police chief had begun with being assaulted by one of his own officers, but it had also demonstrated that real change was possible when leadership was willing to hold people accountable regardless of their badge or uniform. The hardest work was still ahead, but the foundation for reform had been laid in the most dramatic way possible. Danny Blackwood's moment of rage had become the catalyst for everything that needed to change. 6 months after Danny Blackwood's assault on Chief Cole Malone, the federal courthouse in downtown Riverside had become the stage for a trial that would define the future of police accountability in America. The case of United States vs. Daniel Blackwood had attracted national attention, not just because of the shocking nature of the crime, but because it represented the first time in the city's history that a police officer would face federal civil rights charges for assaulting his own commanding officer. The courthouse steps were lined with news vans from CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, and local stations from across California. Protesters from both sides filled the plaza, police reform advocates holding signs reading "Badge doesn't mean above the law" and "Justice for all," while a smaller group of police union supporters displayed banners proclaiming "Support our officers" and "Context matters." The tension was palpable, but it remained peaceful under the watchful eyes of federal marshals and local security. Federal prosecutor Amanda Chen had built her career on civil rights cases, but she had never handled one with such clear-cut evidence and dramatic circumstances. As she prepared for opening statements, Chen reviewed the mountain of evidence that had accumulated since Danny's arrest. Courthouse security footage that captured every moment of the assault, testimony from 42 witnesses, Danny's personnel file documenting years of misconduct, and Cole's dignified victim impact statement. Chen's team had spent months building their case, interviewing every witness, analyzing every frame of security footage, and documenting the pattern of complaints against Danny that had been systematically ignored by department leadership. The evidence was so overwhelming that Chen's biggest challenge was presenting it in a way that didn't seem like prosecutorial overkill. "This isn't just about one officer's bad day," Chen explained to her team during their final preparation meeting. "This is about a culture that enabled and protected someone like Blackwood for years. We need to show the jury that federal intervention was necessary because local accountability mechanisms had failed completely." Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh faced an impossible task in defending Danny's actions. After 6 months of reviewing evidence and interviewing witnesses, she had concluded that her only hope was to argue for mitigation based on Danny's lack of criminal history and his years of police service. The assault itself was captured on video and witnessed by dozens of people. There was no factual dispute about what had happened. Walsh had met with Danny dozens of times, trying to prepare him for testimony while also managing his expectations about the likely outcome. Danny remained convinced that his years of police service should count for something, that the union would find a way to protect him, and that federal prosecutors were overreaching by treating a local incident as a civil rights violation. "Jennifer, I was just doing my job," Danny insisted during their final preparation session. "I saw someone acting suspicious, and I responded according to my training. How was I supposed to know he was the new chief? Nobody told us he was starting early." Walsh had grown tired of Danny's refusal to accept responsibility for his actions. Danny, your training didn't include kicking unarmed citizens in courthouses. Your job didn't include assaulting people for sitting quietly and reading documents. You need to understand that you're facing federal prison time, and your only hope is to show genuine remorse for what you did. The jury selection had taken 3 days, with both sides carefully screening potential jurors for biases about police officers and racial issues. The final jury consisted of 8 women and 4 men, representing a diverse cross-section of the community that would hear evidence and render judgment on whether Danny's assault constituted a federal civil rights violation. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Chen began her opening statement, her voice carrying the weight of decades of unprosecuted police misconduct. This case is about a police officer who forgot that his badge was a symbol of service, not a license for violence. On the morning of January 15th, Officer Daniel Blackwood committed a federal crime in full view of a packed courtroom, assaulting a citizen for the crime of existing while black. Chen clicked a remote control, and the courthouse security footage appeared on courtroom screens, showing Danny's brutal kick, connecting with Cole's ribs and sending the new police chief sprawling across the marble floor. Several jurors visibly winced at the violence, and one elderly woman shook her head in disgust. The defendant will claim this was a misunderstanding, that he didn't know who Chief Malone was, Chen continued. But that defense actually proves our case. Officer Blackwood thought it was acceptable to assault a citizen as long as that citizen didn't have enough authority to hold him accountable. That mindset is exactly what federal civil rights laws were designed to address. Chen spent 40 minutes outlining the prosecution's case, describing the pattern of complaints against Danny, the systemic failures that had protected him from accountability, and the federal government's responsibility to intervene when local institutions failed to protect citizens' constitutional rights. Ladies and gentlemen, Walsh said as she began her opening statement, what you witnessed on that video was wrong. My client made a terrible mistake that he regrets deeply. But Daniel Blackwood is not a career criminal. He's a police officer who served his community for 8 years, who made split-second decisions under pressure, and who deserves your consideration of the circumstances that led to this tragic incident. Walsh's strategy was to humanize Danny and argue for the minimum possible sentence, but even she knew that the evidence was overwhelming and the political pressure for accountability was unprecedented. She spent 20 minutes describing Danny's military service, his commendations from the police department, and the stress that officers faced in dealing with dangerous situations on a daily basis. My client made a serious error in judgment, Walsh concluded, but that error doesn't justify destroying his life with federal prison time. Officer Blackwood has already lost his career, his pension, and his reputation. Justice doesn't require vengeance. In the gallery, Cole Malone sat in the front row, his presence serving as a constant reminder to the jury of the dignity and professionalism that Danny had assaulted. Cole had recovered physically from his injuries, but the emotional impact of being victimized by one of his own officers had strengthened his resolve to reform the department and restore community trust. Behind Cole sat community members who had been victimized by Danny over the years. Tanya Ford, whose teenage son had been subjected to excessive force during a traffic stop. Marcus Johnson, who had been illegally detained and searched during a routine encounter, and Angela Martinez, who had been verbally abused and physically intimidated when she tried to file a complaint about Danny's conduct. Chief Malone, Prosecutor Chen called as her first witness. Please tell the jury what you were doing at the courthouse on the morning of January 5th. Cole stood and walked to the witness stand, with the measured pace of someone accustomed to testifying in court proceedings. His uniform was pressed to perfection, his bearing confident but not arrogant, and his voice carried the quiet authority that had made Danny's assault so shocking to witnesses. I was conducting an unannounced observation of how local law enforcement interacted with the judicial system, Cole testified. As the newly appointed police chief, I wanted to understand departmental culture and identify areas that needed reform. I chose to observe in civilian clothes to get an authentic view of how officers behaved when they thought they weren't being evaluated by supervisors. Chen walked Cole through the events of that morning with methodical precision. His arrival at the courthouse, his decision to sit in the gallery and review personnel files, his interaction with Danny, and the moment when an unprovoked kick sent him sprawling across the courtroom floor. Chief Malone, Can you describe Officer Blackwood's demeanor during your initial interaction? Chen asked. Officer Blackwood approached me with obvious hostility, Cole replied. His body language was aggressive, his voice was raised, and he seemed to view my presence in the courthouse as a personal affront to his authority. When I politely explained that I had a right to observe public court proceedings, he became increasingly agitated. Did you do anything to provoke Officer Blackwood's assault? Chen asked. I was sitting quietly, reading documents and taking notes, Cole replied evenly. When Officer Blackwood approached me and demanded that I move to a different section, I politely explained that I had a right to observe public court proceedings. That's when he became agitated and ultimately violent. Chen spent 2 hours walking Cole through his testimony, establishing not just the facts of the assault, but the broader context of police misconduct that Danny's behavior represented. Cole's calm professional demeanor stood in stark contrast to the violence that Danny had displayed, making it clear to jurors which man deserved their respect and which deserved their condemnation. Defense attorney Walsh's cross-examination focused on Cole's decision to observe court proceedings without identifying himself to local officers, suggesting that the lack of communication had contributed to the misunderstanding that led to Danny's assault. Chief Malone, wouldn't it have been more appropriate to announce your presence to courthouse security and local officers? Walsh asked. Cole's response cut to the heart of the case. Counselor, I was observing how officers treat citizens when they believe no one in authority is watching. If I had announced my presence, I would have seen performance rather than reality. Officer Blackwood's behavior toward me was the same behavior he had been displaying toward citizens for years. The only difference was that I had the authority to hold him accountable. Walsh pressed further, trying to establish that Cole's unannounced observation had created confusion that led to Danny's overreaction. Chief Malone, don't you think Officer Blackwood's confusion about your identity contributed to his poor judgment? Counselor, Officer Blackwood's confusion was about my authority, not my identity, Cole replied with quiet intensity. He knew exactly who I was, a black man in a business suit sitting in a public courthouse. That's all he needed to know to justify assault in his mind. The prosecution's case unfolded over 3 days, with testimony from courthouse witnesses, expert analysis of the security footage, and a comprehensive review of Danny's disciplinary record. Internal Affairs Captain Diana Foster testified about the pattern of complaints that had been ignored or minimized, painting a picture of systemic failure that had enabled Danny's misconduct for years. Captain Foster, Prosecutor Chen asked, can you describe the complaints that were filed against Officer Blackwood during his 8 years of service? Foster consulted her notes as she delivered a damning recitation of Danny's misconduct. 7 formal complaints, 13 informal complaints, multiple allegations of excessive force, racial bias, and verbal abuse. The complaints came from citizens, defense attorneys, and fellow officers who were uncomfortable with his behavior. What action was taken in response to these complaints? Chen asked. Minimal action in most cases, Foster replied. Officer Blackwood received written reprimands, mandatory training, and brief suspensions, but he was never subjected to serious disciplinary action despite the clear pattern of misconduct. Chen spent an hour walking Foster through specific examples of complaints that had been dismissed or minimized, showing jurors how the system had protected Danny while ignoring his victims. The testimony established that Danny's assault on Cole wasn't an aberration. It was the logical escalation of years of unchecked aggression. Captain Foster, Prosecutor Chen asked, in your professional opinion, was Officer Blackwood's assault on Chief Malone consistent with his documented pattern of behavior? Foster looked directly at the jury as she delivered her devastating assessment. Officer Blackwood's assault on Chief Malone was the logical escalation of years of unchecked aggression and racial bias. The only surprising thing about this incident was that it happened to someone with the authority to hold him accountable. The most powerful testimony came from community members who had filed complaints against Danny over the years. Tanya Ford, whose teenage son had been subjected to excessive force during a traffic stop, took the stand to describe Danny's pattern of targeting young black men with aggressive tactics and dehumanizing language. Officer Blackwood treated my son like he was already guilty of something, just for being young and black. Tanya testified, her voice steady despite the emotional weight of her words. He used racial slurs, excessive force, and intimidation tactics that had nothing to do with law enforcement and everything to do with putting my child in his place. Tanya described filing a complaint that disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of internal affairs, where it was investigated by officers who worked with Danny and closed without any meaningful action. Her testimony revealed how the system protected officers like Danny while silencing their victims. When I filed a complaint, I was told that the officer's actions were within policy guidelines. Tanya continued, I was made to feel like I was the problem for questioning police conduct. Watching him assault Chief Malone showed me that his behavior wasn't policy, it was prejudice. 3 other community members testified about similar experiences, creating a comprehensive picture of Danny's misconduct that extended far beyond the courthouse assault. Marcus Johnson described being illegally detained and searched during a routine traffic stop where Danny used racial slurs and threatened him with arrest for disrespecting an officer. Angela Martinez testified about Danny's intimidation tactics when she tried to file a complaint about his treatment of her teenage nephew. Officer Blackwood came to my house in uniform off-duty to discuss my complaint, she testified. He made it clear that filing complaints against officers could result in increased police attention to my family and neighborhood. The prosecution was making the case that federal intervention was necessary because local accountability mechanisms had failed completely, and that Danny's assault on Cole represented the same mindset that had victimized the community for years. When Danny took the stand in his own defense on the 4th day of trial, his testimony revealed the mindset that had led to his downfall. Despite months of preparation with his attorney, Danny couldn't help but betray the attitudes that had made him a danger to the community he was sworn to serve. I saw someone who looked suspicious, taking notes in a courtroom, Danny testified. In my experience, people who sit in courtrooms taking notes are usually planning something or gathering intelligence for criminal purposes. I was trying to maintain security and protect the judicial process. Danny's testimony was confident and defensive, showing no real understanding of how his actions had violated Cole's constitutional rights or damaged community trust in law enforcement. He described his assault as use of force to maintain order and insisted that his actions were justified by his perception of a security threat. Prosecutor Chen's cross-examination exposed the racial bias underlying Danny's assessment of Cole as suspicious. Officer Blackwood, what specifically about Chief Malone's behavior struck you as suspicious? Chen asked. He was dressed too nice for that part of town, Danny replied, apparently unaware of how his answer revealed his prejudices. He had expensive clothes, a gold pen, and he was sitting there like he owned the place. In my experience, when someone doesn't fit the normal profile for a location, they're usually up to something. So a well-dressed black man in a public courthouse struck you as suspicious enough to justify physical assault? Chen pressed. Danny's answer sealed his fate. In my experience, when people dress above their station and act like they belong somewhere they don't, they're usually involved in criminal activity or trying to intimidate witnesses. The courtroom fell silent as jurors absorbed the implications of Danny's testimony. He had just admitted that he considered a black man in business attire to be inherently suspicious, that he believed certain people didn't belong in public spaces, and that he felt justified in using violence to enforce his personal prejudices. Judge Margaret Foster, who was presiding over the federal trial, had seen enough police misconduct cases to recognize the significance of Danny's admission. Mr. Blackwood, she said sternly, are you testifying that you believe the victim's race and appearance justified your use of force? Danny's attorney tried to object, but the damage was already done. Danny had confessed to exactly the kind of racial bias that federal civil rights laws were designed to address, and he had done it under oath in front of a jury that was already disturbed by the video evidence of his assault. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all federal charges: deprivation of rights under color of law, assault and battery, and conspiracy to violate civil rights. Judge Foster scheduled sentencing for 2 weeks later, giving Danny time to contemplate the complete destruction of his life and career. As the verdicts were read, Danny's face went white with shock and disbelief. Despite the overwhelming evidence against him, he had convinced himself that his years of police service and the support of his union would somehow protect him from serious consequences. The reality of federal prison time was something he had never seriously contemplated. In the gallery, community members who had been victimized by Danny over the years wept with relief and satisfaction. For the first time in their experience, a police officer who had abused his authority was being held accountable by the justice system that was supposed to protect them. Cole Malone watched the verdict with professional satisfaction, but no personal vindictiveness. The trial had been about more than his individual assault. It had been about establishing that no one, not even police officers, was above the law when they violated citizens' constitutional rights. Outside the courthouse, community leaders and police reform advocates held a spontaneous celebration of the guilty verdicts. Reverend Thomas Washington spoke for many when he declared, "Today's conviction doesn't undo decades of injustice, but it proves that accountability is possible when communities demand it and leaders have the courage to enforce it." The conviction of Daniel Blackwood sent shockwaves through law enforcement agencies across the country, serving as a stark reminder that federal prosecutors were willing to pursue civil rights charges against officers who abused their authority. Police unions called the verdict prosecutorial overreach, while civil rights organizations hailed it as a breakthrough in the fight for police accountability. As Danny was led back to jail to await sentencing, his 8-year career in law enforcement officially ended, not with a retirement ceremony or a transfer to another department, but with federal criminal convictions that would follow him for the rest of his life. Sometimes accountability came slowly, but when it finally arrived, it came with the full weight of federal law and community demand for justice. 2 weeks after Danny Blackwood's conviction on federal civil rights charges, the courthouse was once again packed with spectators, media representatives, and community members who had come to witness what many considered the most significant sentencing in Riverside's history. The federal courtroom buzzed with anticipation as Judge Margaret Foster prepared to deliver a sentence that would not only determine Danny's fate, but send a message about accountability that would reverberate through law enforcement agencies across the nation. Danny sat at the defendant's table in an orange jumpsuit, the confident swagger that had once defined his persona, replaced by the hollow stare of a man who had watched his entire life collapse in slow motion. His wife Sandra had filed for divorce 3 weeks after his conviction, taking their 2 young children and moving across the country to start over without the stigma of being married to a disgraced police officer. His parents had stopped returning his calls from jail, and former colleagues had distanced themselves from him as if his disgrace might be contagious. Defense attorney Jennifer Walsh had spent the 2 weeks since conviction preparing a mitigation package that emphasized Danny's military service, his previously clean criminal record, and letters of support from family members who still believed in his capacity for redemption. It was a thin foundation for requesting mercy, but it was all she had to work with, given the overwhelming evidence of his guilt and the shocking nature of his testimony. "Your Honor," Walsh began her sentencing argument, "Daniel Blackwood made a terrible mistake that he will regret for the rest of his life. But he is not an irredeemable monster. He is a man who served his country in the military, who dedicated 8 years to police work, and who deserves an opportunity to rebuild his life after paying an appropriate price for his crimes." Walsh's argument focused on requesting the minimum possible sentence under federal guidelines, emphasizing that Danny had already lost his career, his pension, his family, and his reputation. She argued that additional punishment should focus on rehabilitation rather than retribution, and that Danny could serve as an example of redemption if given the chance. Federal prosecutor Amanda Chen approached the podium with a thick folder containing victim impact statements, community letters demanding accountability, and documentation of the broader reforms that had been implemented in response to Danny's case. Her argument would focus not just on punishing Danny's individual crimes, but on sending a message that would deter similar misconduct throughout the law enforcement community. "Your Honor," Chen began, "the defendant's crimes represent more than individual misconduct. They represent a systemic failure of accountability that endangered every citizen in this community. Officer Blackwood spent years using his badge as a weapon against vulnerable people, protected by a culture that valued loyalty over justice. Federal intervention was necessary because local institutions had failed completely. Chen spent 30 minutes documenting the broader impact of Danny's misconduct, describing how his behavior had undermined community trust, endangered public safety, and violated the constitutional rights of countless citizens. She argued that significant prison time was necessary to demonstrate that civil rights violations would be prosecuted to the full extent of federal law. The defendant's assault on Chief Malone was shocking in its brazenness, but it was consistent with years of documented misconduct that local authorities chose to ignore. Chen continued, "Federal sentencing guidelines exist to ensure that civil rights violations carry serious consequences, and this case represents exactly the kind of misconduct those laws were designed to address." Before announcing his sentence, Judge Foster invited victim impact statements from Cole Malone and community members who had been affected by Danny's conduct. The statements would provide a human face to the legal proceedings and help the court understand the broader implications of Danny's crimes. Cole Malone approached the podium with the same dignified bearing that had characterized his response to the assault 6 months earlier. His victim impact statement would focus not on personal revenge, but on institutional transformation and community healing. "Your Honor," Cole began, "Officer Blackwood's assault on me was painful and traumatic, but it also provided our community with an unprecedented opportunity to confront the reality of police misconduct and demand real accountability. The physical injuries from his attack healed within weeks, but the damage to community trust had been accumulating for years." Cole's statement described the broader reforms that had been implemented in the Riverside Police Department since Danny's arrest: mandatory body cameras for all officers, civilian oversight of disciplinary proceedings, community input on hiring and training, and regular public reporting on complaint resolution. He emphasized that Danny's downfall had become a catalyst for positive change. "I don't seek maximum punishment for Officer Blackwood, but I do seek justice for every citizen who has been victimized by officers who forgot that their badge represents service, not supremacy." Cole continued, "The sentence in this case should reflect our community's commitment to equal justice under law, regardless of who wears the uniform." Tanya Ford, whose teenage son had been victimized by Danny's excessive force, delivered an emotional statement about the lasting impact of police misconduct on families and communities. Her voice was steady but filled with years of accumulated pain as she described the fear and mistrust that Danny's behavior had created. "Your Honor, Officer Blackwood didn't just assault Chief Malone in that courtroom," Tanya said. "He assaulted every parent who has watched their child leave the house wondering if they'll encounter a police officer who sees them as a threat rather than a citizen deserving protection. He assaulted every family that has been torn apart by false arrests, excessive force, and a system that protects bad cops more than it protects good people." Tanya's statement described the psychological impact of Danny's misconduct on her family, the way her son had developed anxiety around police officers, and the broader community trauma that resulted from years of unchecked abuse. She called for a sentence that would send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Marcus Johnson, who had been illegally detained and searched by Danny during a routine traffic stop, described how the encounter had affected his view of law enforcement and his willingness to cooperate with police investigations. His statement highlighted the way individual misconduct undermined broader public safety efforts. "Officer Blackwood made me afraid of the people who are supposed to protect me," Marcus testified. "When police officers act like occupying soldiers instead of public servants, they make every citizen less safe and every legitimate investigation more difficult." The sentence in this case should reflect the damage that bad cops do to everyone: victims, communities, and good officers who are trying to do their jobs properly. 3 other community members delivered similar statements, creating a comprehensive picture of how Danny's misconduct had affected individuals, families, and the broader community's relationship with law enforcement. Their testimony provided crucial context for understanding why federal intervention had been necessary. Judge Foster listened to each statement with careful attention, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions about the broader impact of Danny's behavior. As a veteran federal judge who had presided over hundreds of civil rights cases, she understood that sentencing decisions in police misconduct cases carried implications far beyond the individual defendant. When the victim impact statements concluded, Judge Foster asked Danny if he wished to make a statement before sentencing. Danny's attorney had coached him extensively on the importance of showing genuine remorse and accepting responsibility for his actions. But Danny's response revealed that he still didn't fully understand the gravity of his crimes. "Your Honor, I want to apologize to Chief Malone and the community for my actions," Danny said, reading from a prepared statement. "I made a serious error in judgment that has cost me everything I worked for, over 8 years of police service. I hope that my punishment will allow me to eventually rebuild my life and contribute positively to society." Judge Foster noted that Danny's statement focused primarily on his own losses rather than the harm he had caused to others. His apology seemed calculated rather than genuine, and he showed no real understanding of the racial bias that had motivated his assault or the broader impact of his misconduct on community trust. "Mr. Blackwood," Judge Foster said sternly, "your statement suggests that you view this case as a personal tragedy rather than a civil rights violation. You seem to believe that your punishment is about restoring your reputation rather than protecting the constitutional rights of the citizens you were sworn to serve." Judge Foster's sentencing statement reflected her understanding of the broader implications of the case and the need to send a clear message about federal commitment to civil rights enforcement. "Mr. Blackwood, you have been convicted of violating the civil rights of a citizen under color of law, which represents one of the most serious crimes in our legal system," Judge Foster began. "When police officers abuse their authority, they undermine the very foundation of public safety and democratic governance. Your crimes were particularly egregious because they were committed against your own commanding officer, demonstrating a complete disregard for both legal authority and basic human dignity." The judge reviewed the evidence that had been presented during trial, emphasizing the pattern of misconduct that had preceded Danny's assault on Cole and the systemic failures that had enabled his behavior for years. "The evidence in this case reveals that your assault on Chief Malone was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of years of documented misconduct that local authorities chose to ignore," Judge Foster continued. "You used your badge as a weapon against vulnerable citizens, particularly members of minority communities who had limited recourse when you violated their rights." Judge Foster described the broader reforms that had been implemented in response to Danny's case, noting that his conviction had become a catalyst for positive change throughout the law enforcement community. She emphasized that federal sentencing guidelines existed to ensure that civil rights violations carried serious consequences. "The sentence in this case must reflect several important considerations," Judge Foster explained. "First, it must provide just punishment for the serious federal crimes you committed. Second, it must deter similar misconduct by other law enforcement officers who might believe their badges make them immune from accountability. Third, it must acknowledge the harm you caused not just to Chief Malone but to every citizen whose rights you violated during your career." The judge sentenced Danny to 5 years in federal prison, lifetime disqualification from law enforcement, forfeiture of his police pension, restitution to his victims, and 3 years of supervised probation following his release. The sentence was at the high end of federal guidelines, but reflected the serious nature of his crimes and the need to send a strong message about accountability. "Mr. Blackwood, I hope you will use your time in federal prison to reflect on the harm you caused and develop a genuine understanding of why civil rights laws exist," Judge Foster concluded. "Your badge was meant to protect and serve all citizens equally, regardless of their race, class, or status. By using that badge as a weapon against the vulnerable, you betrayed everything law enforcement is supposed to represent." As Danny was led away in handcuffs for what would likely be the last time, Cole Malone reflected on the strange journey that had brought them to this moment. A violent assault had become a catalyst for reform. A moment of trauma had become a teaching moment about accountability, and a police officer's downfall had become a community's opportunity for healing and transformation. Outside the courthouse, community leaders and police reform advocates held a press conference to discuss the broader implications of Danny's sentencing and the ongoing work of police reform. Reverend Thomas Washington spoke for many when he emphasized that individual accountability was just the beginning of necessary changes. Today's sentence represents justice for Officer Blackwood's victims, but it also represents hope for everyone who believes that police officers should be held to the same legal standards as the citizens they serve, Reverend Washington declared. "We cannot let this moment pass without demanding the systemic changes that will prevent future abuses." The press conference announced a comprehensive police reform agenda that had been developed in response to Danny's case: expanded civilian oversight, mandatory bias training for all officers, community input on police policies, and regular public reporting on complaint resolution. The reforms had the support of Chief Malone and had been formally adopted by the City Council. Cole Malone used the media attention to announce additional reforms that were being implemented in the Riverside Police Department, including a new early warning system to identify problematic officers before their misconduct escalated, expanded community policing programs, and partnership with local universities to study effective accountability mechanisms. Officer Blackwood's assault on me was traumatic and painful, but it also provided us with an opportunity to demonstrate that real accountability is possible when leaders have the courage to enforce it, Cole said during his press conference. The reforms we're implementing will ensure that future officers understand that their authority comes from the people they serve, not from the badge they wear. The Riverside Police Department had undergone dramatic changes in the months following Danny's arrest. 12 officers with documented patterns of misconduct had been terminated or forced to resign. Training programs had been completely overhauled to emphasize constitutional policing and bias awareness, and community relations had improved significantly as residents saw evidence of real accountability. Officer Janet Rivera, who had been Danny's partner at the time of his assault on Cole, had become one of the department's most effective advocates for reform. She testified before the City Council about the culture of silence that had protected officers like Danny, and she helped develop new policies that encouraged officers to report misconduct by their colleagues. I knew Danny was a problem, but I felt powerless to challenge him because the system punished whistleblowers more than it punished bad cops, Rivera testified. Chief Malone has created an environment where good officers can speak up about problems without fear of retaliation, and that's made all of us better at our jobs. The federal investigation that had been triggered by Danny's case led to broader reforms throughout California law enforcement, with several other departments implementing similar accountability measures under federal oversight. The Department of Justice used Danny's case as a model for how federal civil rights laws could be effectively enforced to deter police misconduct. FBI Special Agent Sarah Kim, who had led the federal investigation, described Danny's case as a turning point in civil rights enforcement. Officer Blackwood's conviction demonstrates that federal prosecutors are willing and able to hold police officers accountable when they violate citizens' constitutional rights, Agent Kim explained. The sentence in this case sends a clear message that badges don't provide immunity from criminal prosecution. 1 year after Danny's sentencing, Cole Malone was invited to speak at the International Association of Chiefs of Police annual conference about the reforms that had been implemented in Riverside. His presentation, titled Accountability Through Leadership, became one of the most requested sessions at the conference and led to consulting opportunities with dozens of departments facing similar challenges. Accountability isn't about punishing officers, Cole explained to his audience of police executives. Accountability is about creating systems that help good officers succeed while preventing bad officers from harming the communities we're sworn to serve. Officer Blackwood's assault on me was traumatic, but it also provided us with an opportunity to demonstrate that real reform is possible when leadership has the courage to enforce consistent standards. Cole's presentation included data showing dramatic improvements in community trust, reductions in use of force incidents, and decreased complaint rates following the implementation of accountability reforms. The Riverside model was being studied and replicated by departments across the country as evidence that police reform could improve both community relations and officer effectiveness. Danny Blackwood, meanwhile, was serving his federal sentence at a minimum security facility in Central California, participating in educational programs and working in the prison library. His appeals had been exhausted, and he was beginning to understand that his law enforcement career was permanently over. Fellow inmates who had been arrested by corrupt police officers took particular pleasure in reminding him of his fall from grace. Letters from his children, now living with their mother in another state, had stopped coming after the first few months of his incarceration. His parents visited occasionally, but the conversations were strained and focused more on practical concerns than emotional support. Danny was beginning to understand that the consequences of his actions extended far beyond his own punishment. In quieter moments, Danny sometimes reflected on the choices that had led to his downfall. The assault on Cole Malone had lasted less than 10 seconds, but it had destroyed everything he had spent years building. He wondered what might have been different if he had treated citizens with the same respect he expected for himself, if he had seen his badge as a responsibility rather than a privilege. The Danny Blackwood case became required reading in police academies and criminal justice programs across the country, studied as an example of how individual misconduct could undermine entire institutions and how federal civil rights laws could be effectively enforced to protect constitutional rights. Law professors used security footage of Danny's assault to illustrate the importance of accountability and the consequences of unchecked authority. 3 years after Danny's sentencing, Cole Malone was appointed to serve on a federal task force developing national standards for police accountability and community relations. His experience as both a victim of police misconduct and a successful reform leader made him a unique voice in discussions about how to improve law enforcement while maintaining public safety. The task force's recommendations, heavily influenced by the Riverside model that had emerged from Danny's case, were adopted by hundreds of police departments and became the foundation for federal legislation requiring accountability measures in agencies receiving federal funding. The reforms prevented countless future incidents of misconduct and helped restore community trust in law enforcement. Cole often reflected on the strange path that had led from personal victimization to institutional transformation. Danny Blackwood's moment of uncontrolled rage had become the catalyst for changes that protected thousands of citizens from similar abuse. Sometimes justice worked in mysterious ways, transforming trauma into accountability and individual tragedy into collective progress. The courthouse where Danny had committed his career-ending assault now displayed a plaque commemorating the civil rights reforms that had emerged from his case. Visitors could read about how one officer's downfall had become a community's opportunity for healing, and how federal law enforcement had demonstrated that constitutional rights would be protected regardless of who violated them. As Cole drove past the courthouse on his way to work each morning, he was reminded that justice wasn't just about punishment or revenge. Justice was about creating systems that protected everyone equally, held everyone accountable consistently, and ensured that badges represented service rather than supremacy. Danny Blackwood's assault had been painful and traumatic, but it had also become the foundation for everything that needed to change. Sometimes the worst moments in our lives become the catalysts for the most important progress. Sometimes individual accountability becomes institutional transformation. And sometimes justice served becomes justice that serves everyone equally under law. Each share, each comment, each like helps ensure that stories of accountability and transformation reach people who need to see that change is possible, that dignity under pressure can create lasting progress. If this story of instant karma and systematic reform resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe to Color of Justice. Help us continue telling stories that matter, stories that document both the persistence of bias and the possibility of transformation when leaders have the courage to enforce accountability equally.